All right, folks. Well, for those of you following along on Facebook, you already know this is here. And so I'm going to play the little clip that I had posted on Facebook to introduce you to this. I picked up a Saturn twin cam 1.9. And this is something that I've been wanting to do for a really long time. Actually, as a matter of fact, since these cars were still new on the lot. Because the Saturn 1.9 is actually a really good engine. And while it does technically suffer from some oil control issues, those are actually a very fixable problem. Valve seals are one thing. The replacement valve seals are much better than what the factory had. And the pistons themselves had a very poor drain back for the oil around the oil control ring. And what would happen is the oil would coke up around the ring and it would seize the ring up, and well, you'd end up with an oil burner. The nice thing is these engines are 100 pounds lighter than the engine that's in the Chevette, and they make double the horsepower. They also make a lot of easy horsepower on top of that. So there'll be some updates on this as we go. For the most part, I'm going to drop it in stock, but yeah, I can't leave anything stock, especially once it's proven. It's here. I have a couple parts I need to get for it yet. Like, I need to figure out what intake manifold I want to run on it. And I have a couple other starters I want to try in there, but my buddy Rob's got a starter for me. So, I'm minus a harness and an ECU, so I can't get it to run yet. But I have what I need to get it in the car. So it's here, and at some point we're going to see a little bit more about that. So stay tuned. All right, everybody. So without further ado, I give you a 700R4 bolted to an LLO. I'm not kidding. It's dead on. So GM, being GM, will forever use a bell housing pattern. Literally, as long as they can possibly get away with using a bell housing pattern, they will. All they do is they tend to move like one or two of the bolts around to make it specific for whatever engine family it's going to, so you can't technically interchange stuff. Kind of like a North Star. This bolt here on a North Star engine is slightly higher because they got a 4T80, and the 4T80 is too big to clear the bolt in the typical 60-degree lambda pattern, so they move the bolt up just a little bit. That matters not when you're going to put it on a rear-wheel drive transmission. So now we get to the fun part. You'll notice that it is sitting apart, and there's a reason for that. The reason for that is because the dowel pins do not have a home in the bell housing on this transmission. Saturn's transmission pattern is, for all it's worth, a modified lambda pattern. And what you get here as a result of that is the top two bolts line right up. The top two bolts have the exact same spacing. And if you were to draw a bunch of lines across every one of these holes and across the center line of the transmission and do the same for the Saturn, the center line is identical. So what happens here, obviously the dowel pin here is ever so slightly off. It lines up, it's just lower. And then on this side, same deal. It's not in alignment. It's in further than this one, but it's down and over ever so slightly. And another thing the Saturn does, because the Saturn only uses 4 bell housing bolts, is it uses these lower two holes, these two bosses right here on either side of the block, on this big like horseshoe thing that bolts into the lower part of the transaxle down here. So if you have a late model 4L60 that has that lower aluminum inspection cover, you actually could tie that in to here with a brace on either side, which will help. And that'll give you 6 spots to hold this transmission to this block. Something I'm going to do is just use the ones that are here. I believe this one's probably not a aluminum covered one, but the bolts are big enough I can get away with a bracket of some sort that goes between here and here. I also would like to utilize these 2 bosses on either side for some sort of an engine bracket, because there's not a lot of thick bosses on these blocks aside from right here and right here. This is for the axle, so I know that these are strong enough to be used for an engine mount if needed. But on the other side, it gets a little more complicated, because this side never had anything mounted to it. And there is an unused boss right here. It looks like it's already got a hole tapped for a small bolt. I probably wouldn't want to go much bigger than that. These are the way these are cast. Once you start getting things thin, they start breaking easy, which is why I was warned not to put a lot of weight on this particular lug, because you can break the corner of it off. So this side may just end up with the mount being built off of here. What I'm going to do with the automatic, something I don't necessarily have to worry about with the stick shift. If I was to put a T5 on this, it'd be very easy. It's machine a pilot bushing to cover the distance between the crank and the pilot shaft as normal, although it is a specific size that you're going to have to make for the Saturn. And then you use the Saturn flywheel, and it's a combination of like a Cavalier clutch disc and a Saturn pressure plate, and then you use a hydraulic throwout bearing on your T5. Pretty standard issue stuff, just like what I'm doing on Scooter over there. As far as the automatic goes, though, obviously if I close this gap up, that pilot ends up in the back of the crank, but only just ever so slightly does it end up in the back of the crank, which gives me a big distance between the flywheel and the torque converter. Big distance. The nice thing about that, though, is that allows me to make an adapter ring. And the reason why an adapter ring is going to make it real easy to do this is because I can make an adapter ring that bolts to here with countersunk bolts that will take up the distance, and then we'll bolt to the flywheel using bolts through the flywheel. And the reason this will work out is because the Saturn flywheel has 4 bolts that hold it to the torque converter, and the 700R4 uses 3, and they do not overlap anywhere on this flywheel. So I can get away with 3 countersunk bolts in an adapter ring to close up the gap to get the torque converter to bolt to that flywheel. So there's some engineering hurdles, but they're not very big ones. And because this one is not a 4L60E, it only has lockup that I'm going to have to worry about, which I can get an aftermarket lockup kit cheap, or I'm willing to bet I can get the Saturn's computer to lock that torque converter. I will have the speedometer cable set up, because this is an early cable drive speedometer setup on this one. So I'll have to get a stubby sensor that screws in here, gives me the pigtail for the speed sensor, and then allows me to run the stock cable from there up. And what that's going to do, the Saturn computer wants to see the speed sensor. It doesn't necessarily have to see a correct speed, it just needs to see that the car moves. Otherwise it locks the RPMs out to about 4,800 RPM or 4,500 RPM, and it won't let it over rev itself until it sees the car move. Once it sees the car moving, then it'll let you rev it up to about 7, I think, or it's just shy of 7. So, yeah, a little bit to go, but for the most part, this is already just about figured out. As far as the oil pan goes, I'm going to do the same thing I did with Scooter. I'm going to hack the bottom of a Chevette oil pan off, hack the bottom of the Saturn oil pan off, and then combine them. That'll let it clear the cross member. As far as dimensions go, this Saturn engine ends up, it was like an inch and a half shorter overall length than the 1.6, and that's because the water pump doesn't stick clear off the front of it. It also, overall height, I think, ends up an inch and a half shorter if you count the air filter housing on the Chevette. So, losing 100 pounds, it'll fit under the hood, it'll fit between the firewall and the core support with ease, and it bolts to 60-degree GM lambda pattern transmissions. I mean, sort of, but close enough. I can make that work in my garage with hand tools and some good measurements if I had the material. All right, well, that's the last of what I'm going to touch on this for the time being. This is going to get put in a corner. We are right back on this. I am about to put that dashboard back together for the last time. I got some wiring to do behind that cluster and a little trimming to do on the cluster itself, and then this is all back together. This is coming along really fast, so you're going to see a lot more videos on this here real soon, and a lot more updates coming regularly. So in the meantime, guys, keep the shiny side up.